Hello, I hope you had a good lunch. It's really great to be here in Amsterdam. I'm Rachel Andrew, as already introduced. I'm a web developer and I've been working on the web since about 1996, which makes me quite old. And it means that I'm old enough to remember when the battles we were having was whether we should use CSS at all or whether we should stick to our old faithful font tags. So I was using CSS for layout right back when Netscape 4 was a browser with a lot of market share. And I was a Web Standards project member, and what I was doing in the Web Standards project was actually working with Macromedia, as then owned Dreamweaver. And we were working with them trying to encourage standards in the markup that their authoring tool created. And as Chris mentioned, I now have a CMS product. And so a lot of the things I talk about come back to helping my customers in support with the things they're trying to do. And the things I'm talking about today, my interest in Grid really started because of my interest in content management and my interest in visual layout tools. And when I first saw the Grid spec, I thought there's something in this for people like me. Because I love CSS. And there's so many great things we can now do with CSS, stuff that would have blown my mind back when I started, when I was battling with Netscape 4 and what have you. And the fact we can do things like animation and so on. But layout seems to have kind of fallen by the wayside a bit. We're still battling with all of these problems of doing layout and these kind of hacks. And I don't think I need to explain to this audience exactly where all of these things fall down. And we can do layout. We're good at doing layout. We've learned how to hack our way around all these problems. But they do cost us developer hours, and we all have to learn how to tame these methods, and we have to debug them, and we have to teach junior developers how to do this stuff. We often have to make compromises on our document source because, okay, maybe at one layout we can get the source we want and the layout we want, but what about all those different breakpoints? We've kind of seen stuff like that already today. We're leaning increasingly on frameworks, a lot of the time to kind of help with the maths of doing these layouts. And we're doing things like we're adding markup to create grids, adding stuff into our markup to actually describe the layouts, which isn't ideal. And we're often using preprocessors and things just to abstract all the layout hacks because they're a pain. And we've heard about Flexbox this morning. And Flexbox is great, it's fantastic. It's really great for all the things we saw this morning and for the elegant layout of UI items. But it's not really designed for full-page layout. That's not the task it was designed for. Flexbox is really designed for things that are or could be laid out in an unbroken line. And I think we're starting to see stuff out there on the web. We're starting to see kind of grid systems that are based on Flexbox. And I'm kind of worried about those because I think we've already got enough layout hacks. And trying to force Flexbox into being a sort of grid layout method isn't ideal. So we need something that works with Flexbox. We need something that's designed for the sort of things we're trying to lay out today, the sort of applications we're trying to develop, because a lot of the time we're actually doing very complex application design. And I think we've got that with CSS Grid Layout. And in the next little while, I'm going to blast through a whole load of code examples of how the grid works. And they are all backed up with stuff that's online. I'll be publishing my slides, all the code's online. So the fact I'm going very quickly through this, you'll be able to have a look at it all later. So straight away into the code, here's some HTML. I've got a div with a class of wrapper, I've got 6 child elements, and they've each got a class. I'm going to declare a grid on the wrapper. So the first thing we do is we say we want to use grid layout. So this is a new value of the display property. You can also use the value inline grid, and that does exactly what you'd expect. It creates an inline grid. And we then use 2 new properties. These are properties created for CSS Grid Layout. Grid template columns creates our grid columns, and grid template rows creates rows. I'm using the auto keyword for size. I want that row to stretch to contain whatever goes into it. So wrapper now has a grid of 3 content columns with 2 10-pixel gutters and 2 content rows separated by a 10-pixel gutter. If you could see the grid, it'd look a bit like this. So we can now put child items onto that grid. If I want to place a div with a class of A, top left, I'd use these properties. Grid column start and grid column end allow us to define the lines before and after where the content sits, and row start and row end is kind of above and below. So that puts item A into the top left cell of the grid. And I might want to do the same with B. I'd like to put this one bottom center, just like this. So to place B into the second content cell of the grid, I'm actually starting at line 3, because line 2 is that line before the track that I'm using for a gutter. And we're also only spanning single cells here, but we don't have to just span single cells. We can span as many as we like. So for B to span over 2 content columns, which is actually 2 content columns and the gutter track, we change grid column n to 6. Now that's quite verbose. Obviously we've got 4 properties to define every line. There's quite a lot of that, so as you'd imagine, there's shorthand. So these are the rules for our 2 positioned items, and we can compress those. So grid column and grid row. And if you note there's a / there separating the values, the first value is start, the second is end. You can actually go a step further. We can compress them down to 1 line using the grid area property. And the order of those lines is grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end. It's essentially the opposite direction to margins and padding. I know not why. I think that's quite confusing. I think that syntax is quite confusing, actually. If you'd done it and then you went back to it, your sort of future self would not be pleased with you. So I kind of like the previous declaring it with 2 properties. But there you go, and we will revisit the grid area property later because it's used for something else. Grid lines are indexed according to the writing mode of the document. So in all my examples, they're indexed left to right because I'm using English. But if you're using a right to left language, they'd be the other way. So that's the very basics of positioning things on the grid. Grid is a massive spec, and we're going to be looking at other works examples in a minute. But before I do that, I'm just going to describe some of the terminology that you come across because it'll make our lives easier. So we've seen grid lines. So lines can be numbered, which is what we've already looked at. They can also be named. A track is any row or column between 2 row or column lines. So we had gutter tracks and we had content tracks in the previous example. Then we have cells. They're the smallest unit in our grid that we can put something into, and conceptually, it's just like a table cell. And then we have a grid area, and that's an area on the grid bound by any 4 grid lines. So that's going to include a number of grid cells. And the area is defined by just setting start and end lines. And there'll be more things that we'll encounter as we move through this spec. It's a big spec and there's lots of stuff in it. But these are the core sort of things you need to think about and will help you understand the spec. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to go through a bunch of worked examples. They are all online. This is my website, gridbyexample.com. It's where I put all my little experiments into Grid, and I try and keep that up to date as the spec changes and the implementation in Chrome changes. You need to enable the experimental web platform features flag in order for these things to work. It's behind a flag in Chrome at the moment. So let's look at a sort of more realistic example of using grid. We've already had a look at what's called line-based placement. And so let's look at a sort of real example of that. I'm going to build something like this. Now, that's a fairly straightforward thing. I'm sure everyone would have their own way. They would know how they would build this with floats or whatever. And the grid example is at this URL. So I've got some HTML. I've got a parent with a class of wrapper. It's got some child elements. I've got a header and a couple of divs there. So with just some CSS for the typography and so on, actually from the skeleton framework, it looks a bit like this. And that might be what you use for mobile anyway. So we start by setting up a grid. I've got 3 columns here. The 5% column is acting as a gutter between a sidebar and the main content. And I've added 4 rows. I've got some fixed pixel rows, which are sort of spacing things out, and then some auto rows that I'm actually going to put content into. They're my content tracks. Now, if you set up a grid and you don't position any items, now in this case, you'll see something like this. Now, that looks really weird, but it's less weird if you understand that what grid is trying to do here is position the items on the grid. It knows it's got some stuff and it knows it's got a grid and it's trying to work out where to put things. But it doesn't know that that gutter track, you want to use it as a gutter, so it's trying to stick some content in there. We'll have a look at where that could be useful later, but for now, let's position our items. So we do it like this. The header with a class of main header is going to span right across the grid from column line 1 to line 4. It starts at row line 2 because that's the start of the first auto-size track and finishes at 3. The panel is a sidebar, and then the content area sits next to the panel. So that's our entire layout described. And so we end up with this. Now, if you have a look, the panel there, the background goes right to the bottom of the content area. And that's because the panel and the main content are in the same row. So the background of the panel extends down the row. It doesn't sit behind the content as it might if we were floating things. And it's this ability that for things to know they're part of an overall layout that we get both with Grid and with Flexbox. In all of our previous layout methods, things just didn't know that they existed as part of a bigger layout. They were just things that we were sort of moving around. With Flexbox and with Grid, once things are children of something with either Flexbox or Grid applied to it, they know that they live within a sort of layout method, and so they can respond to each other. And if I overlay the grid there, you can kind of see how that works. So perhaps I'd like to put a footer on my layout. So I've added to my HTML, I've added a footer. And I position it right across the layout from columns line 1 to line 4 and put it between row lines 5 and 6. And so there it is. There's no clearing required because that footer has got its own row on the grid, so it just sits there. It's never going to jump up or anything. The things can't extend down below it because it's in its own row. And if you're observant, you might have realized that row doesn't actually exist. We created an explicit grid. We didn't create anything for that to go into. So that's an interesting thing. Grid will create implicit grid lines if things are positioned outside of the explicit grid. So you can create a grid, but you can continue to stick things, either more columns or more rows, and Grid will just create implicit lines for them. Now, when I started out, I was using tables for layout. I'm sure some of you were. And Grid kind of feels a little bit like using tables in some ways. But of course, it doesn't rely on you structuring your content and splitting up your content in the way that you did if you were using tables. And also, we're entirely describing our layout in CSS here. There's nothing in the markup that describes our layout. So that's very different from using a table. And it also means that we can, at different breakpoints, we can declare a grid, or we can remove a grid, or we can redefine the grid, which, of course, you can't do with a table. And we've already heard a bit about source order and the fact that these lovely new methods get us away from having to kind of worry about the source order in a way. But you can use that for good or evil. You can worry about the source order and make sure that your source order is accessible and is, really correct in terms of the semantics of the document. And then you can use Grid to move things around at your different layouts, and that's a good way to use it. But you might use Grid as an excuse to forget about the source, and that would definitely be bad. And even worse would be stripping out semantic elements in order to make things a child of the grid, or to make them flex items. That would be a really terrible use of this stuff. So we have responsibility to use these tools really well. So here's an example of how we might start doing some sort of responsive design here. I'm using the same HTML as I had before, and I'm starting mobile first. I'm using the grid here essentially just to rearrange the items in the source a bit, moving the panel down below the content. And I get something like this. I can then, in my media queries, redefine the grid and position the elements to take us back to the two-column layout that we had before. Here I'm adding an explicit row and gutter for the footer. So Grid makes it really easy just to move things around based on your media queries. And because you don't need to worry about source order, once you've defined what sort of source order you think is best for your document, you can then play around with what works best for your content. So we've looked at positioning with numbers, numbering our lines and positioning things according to them. We can also name our lines, and we'll take a look at that now. So we've got the same layout, same markup, and this example is here. So when defining my single column layout, I've named the row lines. So the value is describing the grid track, the size of that track. And so we name the actual lines rather than the content track itself. So positioning items is exactly the same, except we use the name of the line rather than the number. So this becomes this. So that can be really useful. If you're setting up a responsive design, you can name the lines, and then even as they're moving around on the grid, you don't have to work out sort of what number that line now is because it's moved. You can just name it and deal with the name. Now, this has just changed. The spec really recently changed. It used to be that you used parentheses, so rounded braces, instead of the square brackets. So my examples online still use the braces because in Chrome, that hasn't been updated yet. It's been shipped into Blink, the sort of change of this. And when that change actually comes into the browser and you can see the examples using it, I'll update my examples. So this happens quite a lot when dealing with this new spec. Things just kind of change. So we've looked at lines, but there's a whole other way of describing how to position items on the grid. You can use grid named areas using the grid template areas property. And I'm going to show you how we'd create our same layout, but using this method. So I've got the same markup. And we're going to end up with the same layout. And you'll find this example here. So the first thing we do is outside of our media queries, we assign a name to the various page elements that we want to position. So we're using this grid area property again. And this is the property we saw right at the beginning that you can use to define your lines, all 4 lines at once, that I thought was a little bit confusing. So we can use this, though, to actually name the areas. And then I set up my grid for the mobile width layout. So instead of sort of positioning the items with their own rules, I create the layout using the names given to each element as the value of the grid template areas property. And that's all I need to do to create a layout. And the period, the full stop character there, what that's doing is saying that's an empty cell, a null cell. So that's actually my gutters. That's the spacing between those elements. So we end up with a narrow layout like this. And I can overlay the named template areas so that you can see where they are. So if we go to the wider layout, so once again, I'm describing this layout with this kind of ASCII art syntax. You can kind of see what the layout looks like in the grid template areas. And again, we've got those periods, those null cells showing where I've got a gutter. So between sidebar and content there, we've got that gutter track. So that's the wider layout. And if we overlay the template areas, you can see where they are. Now that's quite a nice straightforward way to work for simple layouts. And I actually use this quite a bit, not in production obviously, because no one can use this stuff yet in production, but I use it for prototyping things. Because it's so easy just to move things around. If I'm working out how my breakpoints are going to work, I can do it using grid. I've got to rebuild it using something that's going to work in all the browsers out there for now, but it's kind of a nice way just to play with prototyping in code, which is how I like to work. There's been another change to the spec while we're talking about this. It doesn't break my live examples, but it has been shipped in Blink. It's not made it into Chrome yet. You can use multiple dot period characters, so you can kind of line up your ASCII art a bit nicer if that's what you want to do. I don't know. That seems to be the reason why that's been put in there. You only need white space if you need to separate 2 identical cell types, because obviously header without a space and another header would be a different one to just header. Something interesting that happens when we use named areas like this is we get implicit named grid lines. So that's our layout that we've just been looking at. We've got a named grid area called content. So grid creates for us content start and content end lines for the rows and columns. So I can position an area test to start on the line before the area defined as content, with content start, and end after that area with content end. I'm starting it at the implicit row line content start before content, and I'm finishing after the footer. The line after the footer is footer end. So I end up with a big red box start on top of my content. What this shows you as well is that you can layer items on the grid. You just do that using Z-index like you would with positioned items. So that's quite a useful thing you can do with grid, is actually you can use the grid and you can layer items on top of it. So, there's all sorts of interesting uses could come of that. And this is where we get away from the sort of thing that we had with tables, where things had to sit inside a cell. So I've had a look at some fairly simple examples, but I think that when people think of grid layout, they think of grid systems. And you think of things like the 12 and 16 column grids that we tend to be using and that a lot of the frameworks give us to use. So once I started looking into grid and I'd done some simple things with it, that was really what I wanted to start playing with, is how can we create these sort of complex, flexible grid systems using CSS Grid. So here's an example. This is example code from Bootstrap. Now, what we're doing here in Bootstrap is we are describing our layout in the markup. And it may be that you don't really care about having presentational classes in your markup. Some people say, oh, it doesn't matter, others really care about it. But they're conceptually very heavy. And there's only so far you can go with stuffing classes into your markup to describe breakpoints. It kind of works for maybe 2 or 3, but how many may you have? And you're kind of tied to having to decide, well, we can't add any more here. And also, you can't always get at that markup. Many of us have to work with things that we can't actually get at all the markup that's generated. So with CSS Grid Layout, we're describing layout in CSS. We don't need to add classes to our markup. And we can flexibly redefine the grid at any time. We can introduce a new breakpoint. If we start looking at our site and thinking, that looks a bit funny when it's at that screen, some new devices come out, it looks a bit strange, or the content's changed, we can introduce a new breakpoint without having to go back and put stuff into our markup. So when we're looking at replacing the grid systems that we're already using with CSS Grid Layout, we need to kind of have a completely different idea in our mind of what we're doing. So the typography in my example so far has come from the Skeleton framework. It's a sort of lightweight CSS framework. There's a bit less to it than Bootstrap. I quite like it for doing simple things. So I thought I'd use that because it's a bit more straightforward. But it's very similar to Bootstrap in that you have to add rows and you have to add classes to the markup. And before I dive into this example, I'm just going to show you a couple more sort of things that you need to know to understand the code. Because once you start to create multi-column grids, you get very verbose definitions. So when you create your grid definition, you can use the repeat keyword. So you use the keyword repeat, and then the number of times you want to repeat the pattern, and then the pattern itself. So this statement would give us a line, then a 200 pixel track, then a line, and a 20 pixel gutter track, repeated 4 times. Something else that's interesting, we have this FR, this fraction unit, a flexible length. It represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. And this is great because it saves you doing that thing where you have to calculate all these percentages of things. You can just sort of say, well, I want this track to be twice as wide as this other one. You can specify the proportion of gutter tracks to content tracks. So it's a really nice way to do flexible layout. And we looked at named grid lines. Again, this is the syntax that's changed, and I'm using the newer one in these examples. And I'm taking this a step further because obviously if you use the repeat keyword and you repeat a pattern that has named lines, you're going to have multiple lines that have the same name. And this is useful because you can then use a span keyword to span multiple lines. And that's what we're doing in this simple example. I'm naming the line before a content track, col, and the line before gutter track, gutter. So when I position my content, I start on the second line named col and span 2 lines named gutter. And that becomes a lot clearer when you see it actually in an example being used. So let's have a look at that. This is my markup for the skeleton grid. This is what you need to use if you want to lay some things out with skeleton. We have to add divs for rows, and then we state in a class the number of columns a column can span. And as far as grid systems go, that's pretty much part of the course. It's not as bad as some of them. And we end up with something like this. This is just the kind of example that they use on their site to show it off. So if I want to replicate this using grid layout, the The first thing I can do is strip out a load of markup because we don't need to have those rows and we don't need to have, say, how many columns things span. I'm using the classes box1, box2, but they could be semantic class names, obviously, in a real layout. So I've now removed any description of how the grid works from the markup. And I then create a grid. And it looks a bit more complex because I've got this repeat keyword going on, and I've named the lines. So we're going to have multiple row and column lines and multiple gutters for rows and columns. And outside of the repeat, I'm just sort of tidying it up so I don't end up with a trailing gutter. So you can have a repeating pattern and then a bit that doesn't repeat, whatever you like, really. And then we now place our items on that grid. And I'm using this named line syntax here. So I want box 1 to start the first line named col and span to the fourth line named gutter. The box goes into the first row, so starts the first row line and ends the first gutter line. And here's box 8. We're starting on column line 7 and spanning 3 gutter lines. And because we're using these named lines, we don't need to worry which line of the grid the third gutter line after column line 7 is. We just know we want 3 columns. And that's the complete grid layout version. Again, this is all online. I'll give you a link in a moment. So we can easily replicate these kinds of layout systems. It's quite simple. It's an awful lot less code. And it works really nicely. And grid lets us go a step further and lets us do something that's actually really hard to do with our existing grid layout systems. And that's to control things height, the actual grid rows. So you can span rows in just exactly the same way as we span columns. So I can set up a couple of the boxes to span 2 and 3 gutters for the rows. And so we end up with something like this. And again, the heights will go to the gutter, no matter how much content is in the block. And it's very similar, again, to Flexbox in the way that will work. And you can have a look at that at this URL and have a play around with it. So that's the kind of example. It's the sort of example that you see on grid framework sites, so showing you how to use their grid. And of course, how would we actually lay out a real layout? I'm rebuilding here our 2-column layout just from before, but this time I'm using this skeleton-inspired grid to position it all. So the header and footer start at the first line named col and span to gutter line 12. The header starts after the first row line and the footer the third. And between them, we put the panel and the content. And that comes back to something like this, which is at that URL. So this makes it really easy to play around with layout because we've now got a grid system and we can position things on that grid and we can move things around. So perhaps I'm looking at that footer and I'm thinking, I'd actually like that just to sit underneath the content and be next to the panel column and not underneath it. So that's the CSS I've got so far. And I can change 3 values to make that so. And then we end up with something like this. So it's just really easy to move things around because you're doing it in the CSS. So much easier than having to worry about the markup and where it belongs there. So we've looked at how to position items on our grid. And most of the time, this is what we'll want to do. We'll want to position things explicitly in certain places on the grid. But I think sometimes it might be nice to say, here is a grid, put these things on it, without actually positioning them explicitly. And the specification gives us that ability. And the rules around doing this are defined by the grid item placement algorithm, which, even if you're not wanting to throw things at a grid and have them positioned, it's going to be useful to understand what this is doing, because otherwise you're going to have baffling things happen and not quite know how to fix them. So our initial example, I said that's what was happening here. Grid was trying to position the items, but didn't know that that was a gutter, so was trying to stick something into it. So let's have a look at where this actually might be useful. I've got an unordered list here. It's got a class of wrapper. The first list item contains some text. Everything else is images with a bit of text, just so we can see what they are. And 2 of the list items have a class of wide. So if I don't apply any layout at all, everything just displays in a list as you'd expect. So what I want to do with this here is I'd like to create a responsive layout. Now the text is my priority. So I want that to be front and center really. I want that to come first for mobile, and I want it to be, always a priority in the design. So a slightly wider breakpoint, again, I'd like that text to come first, but I'm going to have 2 columns and arrange my images in 2 columns. And for the desktop view, I'm going to position the text centrally and have the images flowing around it. I've got some wide images. I'd like those to take up 2 columns where I've got multiple columns. And I don't know how many images I'm going to have. It's coming from somewhere else. So I can't position them all separately on the grid. So outside of my media queries, I set things to display grid on the wrapper. And here I'm setting the grid to have 1 column taking up all available space and rows to auto. And I'm using a new property here, grid auto flow. And I've set that to dense. And we'll have a look at what that does in a minute. So we've now got a grid. Not a lot's going to change about the layout, but everything's on the grid. And so every item is now in its own track on the grid because grid is creating those for us. And it looks like this. And now I go to start creating my media queries. So I've now got a 2-column grid. Now the only item I've actually positioned is that list item containing text. I've given it a class of text. It's set to span from line 1 to line 3. Now I've also got those list items that I gave a class of wide. I'm not positioning them, but I'm giving their start position as auto. And I'm giving them a column end of span 2, which means they will have to take up two of the tracks on the grid. And so they're going to go full width, basically. They're going to be the same as that text. So when grid encounters a large image, it knows it needs 2 columns to display it. And if you remember, we set grid auto flow to dense. So what's happened here is that the large item, the wide item, it actually comes before balloons 5 in the source. But it's had to drop down to the next row rather than display next to balloons 3. Balloons 5 has hopped up and filled the gap, taking itself out of the order described in the DOM. And that's what this grid auto flow dense does. It creates a dense packing mode. Grid will try and fill in any gaps rather than just progressing through when it displays things. We can have a look at that here as we go wider. So I've redefined my grid to have 4 equal width columns. I then position that text block so it'll be top center, spanning 2 grid tracks and 2 row tracks. And that's it. That's the wide breakpoint display. So the text column is positioned, the images are going around it, and again, balloons 5 has been taken out of DOM order because of the dense packing mode. You can see the whole thing at this URL. So that's the entire CSS we've used to create that layout. And if we change the value of grid auto flow to sparse, the image balloon 5 now renders after balloon 4. So if you use the sparse packing mode, things stay in DOM order other than things you've given a position to. So things will be positioned first, then everything else will just find itself a space. If you're using sparse, grid moves forward, and that's also the default. So by default, things won't kind of rearrange themselves. If you use dense, then grid will try and backfill, which if you're doing something like an image gallery or whatever, that's quite nice. You might want that to happen. If you're laying out a form, you're not going to want that to happen. You don't want grid to start jumbling up your form fields visually because it's found a hole. So that's the sort of difference between those 2 packing modes. The nice thing here is you can kind of set up rules for how you want certain types of things to be treated. So if, for instance, you had a bunch of images, some were landscape and some were portrait, you want the landscape ones to take up more columns on the grid, you could give them a class and then grid could display them wider than the portrait images, and that would help everything to sort of lay out nicely. So you can kind of set up rules that this is then going to use. So with these examples, I hope that you can see a little bit of the power of grid. And there are a few things with grid layout, and really the whole point of me talking about this stuff, rather than kind of sitting in my office and playing with it, is because I'd like other people to be looking at grid while the spec is still being developed. Because there's a few little things that I've spotted while I've been playing with grid, which I'd like to show you. So these are my sort of little grid gotchas and the things that actually I've come across all the time. And the first of those is what I'll describe as the gutter problem, because I've been working around the gutter problem in all of my examples. Because in the current specification, if you want a gutter track, if you want some spacing between things, you have to explicitly declare that. You have to create a track for it. So we saw this in our simple example. The track between lines 2 and 3 is a gutter, but Grid doesn't know it's a gutter, so the skinny text gets auto-placed into the gutter. In our 12-column grid, we're specifying column lines and gutter lines. In my autoflow example, I'm avoiding the issue altogether, and I'm just using margins and padding to create space rather than using grid. Now, there's kind of prior art for this, because in multicol, we have column gap. And the working group also understand that this is probably something that people want, column gap and a new property row gap. It's a kind of common layout requirement. But it looks like that's been moved to level 2 of the CSS Grid specification. I think that's a shame. I think it makes Grid seem more complicated when you first get started with it. And it means that for simple layouts, you're kind of having to battle with these gutters or just use margins and padding instead. So that's something that I thought maybe is a little bit of an issue. It becomes more of an issue when we're doing things like a very strict grid system. We can specify a repeating pattern of columns and rows. And we generally know how many columns we want. That's fairly normal. You know how wide you want things to be and how many columns you want to work with. But you don't always know how many rows you want. And so at the moment, if you want rows separated by a gutter, you have to specify that pattern as many times as you need. Because Grid will create these implicit row lines, but it's not going to create a kind of gutter and then a row line. There is a way around that particular problem that probably will make it into level 1, and that's the ability to repeat a pattern auto number of times. So we can say repeat this row pattern of an auto-sized track and a 10-pixel gutter as many times as is needed for the content. It doesn't help with a situation where we want to use auto placement, but it does help with just setting up a grid that we want to place things in ourselves. It's not implemented yet, this in Chrome, in Blink. I've got an example on my site, but at the moment it doesn't work. I keep checking it every now and again just in case it's got in. But that's part of the spec at the moment. So the other thing is around this sort of idea of nesting grids and subgrids. So in exactly the same way as you saw this morning with Flexbox, only direct children of the element with grid become grid items. So it doesn't go down into the descendants. It's only direct children. But like Flexbox, where a flex item can become a flex container, it's perfectly valid for an item on grid to also become a grid. So you can nest grids. So here I've got a set of divs, each of the class of box, and box D has E, F, and G nested inside it. If I declare a grid on the wrapper div and position all of the children, we get this. And the light boxes here are the children of box D. They're just displaying in line inside the box. To make a grid item a grid, we just declare a grid on it, with its own rows and columns and position things. Grid only controls the direct children, so nothing will be inherited by this new grid. It's independent. And of course, you could actually be using Flexbox inside these elements, and that's quite likely what you would do, but you can nest grids if that's useful. But if you're working with a multiple column layout, like our 12-column example, what would actually be really cool would be if nested items could use the grid declared on the parent. So imagine you had to create a grid on your page, and all items, whether they're direct children or nested, could use the same lines. And that's in the spec at the moment. Level 1 spec also includes a subgrid keyword. So a grid declared as a subgrid uses the grid specified on the parent. So instead of setting up columns and rows on D, we'd use the subgrid keyword. And you can then use that parent grid for rows or columns or both. And if you then position child items, they'll be positioned according to the parent grid's lines. Sadly, though, that's at risk in the current level 1, which means it might be removed from the specification. It's also currently unimplemented in the Blink version. I don't think they're actually working on it. So it looks like that will probably be dropped. I think People will want that because they want things to line up nicely, but it also creates, I think, an accessibility issue if we don't have subgrid. Because I think that what will happen is people will start to remove semantic markup in order to make everything the child of the grid so they can then position things. I think that's a real danger without subgrid. Fantasy is a great example of why we need subgrid here as well on her site. And there's a couple of really good examples there showing you why subgrid is important. So that's just a couple of things that I've found as I've been working through the grid spec over the last few years, really. And I've mentioned those. I know other people have mentioned these things to the working group. And that's great because grid, does need our feedback as people who write CSS. I'm not a spec writer. I'm not from a browser vendor. I'm just a person who builds websites. And so I want more people who build websites, and particularly designers, to start feeding back on a spec like this because I think this spec is really important. So do have a look at these examples. Get back to the working group. Don't wait until the spec is shipped in browsers and then say, well, this isn't very good. It doesn't do what I need it to do. Don't do that. Think about it now and get some feedback in. The spec is still being developed, so there's a chance for changes to happen. The change to the brackets I mentioned is because one of the reasons behind that is that the original syntax was a problem for SAS. And so, I think it's more readable with the square brackets, but that's actual feedback from the community saying this could be a problem. Let's fix it before it becomes implemented in browsers. Grid is coming, and the implementation in Blink is really good. You can use it now. It's behind a flag. So when Grid lands, it's going to land as a fairly complete thing. We're probably not going to have so many problems as we've had with Flexbox, with things changing once it's out there in the wild and we're using it. So you can start to use it now. You can play around with it and see how well it works. There's an older version of Grid in IE10 behind an MS prefix. It is quite different. There are links on my site, because I wrote about the IE10 implementation as well. There are links as sort of what the difference is between the two. It's being implemented in Mozilla. There's also a polyfill under active development, so you can have a look at that. All my examples and a lot more and anything else I come up with will be on this site. So please do have a look. I love talking about this. I love playing with it. It's kind of like my hobby, my sort of weird, nerdy hobby when I'm not doing my work. So I love talking about it. So do have a look and let me know what you think about it. And I hope to have a chat with you over a beer later. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So proceed. It's nice to have something simple and easy to write after lunch break that is not throwing up any confusion at all.
Yeah, sorry.
So, unsurprisingly, you've got lots and lots of questions. A lot of them very confused about little things, and a few of them, it's quite funny getting these questions in and then seeing your slides, and you're like, oh, she just answered that one, excellent, and that one, excellent.
I'll go through any that we don't talk about now and throw some links out there later.
One of them was like, is there a chance to do negative FRs for pull-out quotes and stuff like that, or do you have to create an empty column for that?
You'd have to create a column, I think. Yeah. You sort of, it's... I think Grid is going to be used in conjunction with other stuff. It's not kind of like the only layout method you'll ever need. I kind of see it and Flexbox sort of should be going along in parallel. We should be considering them as our layout toolkit, really. And other things that we've got. There's other stuff coming up, things like exclusions and so on, which are, I think all working together. It's kind of a mature layout for the web.
It's pretty nuts what we're going to do with layouts on the web. It's like exclusions, regions, all these kind of things. It feels like Canvas in an HTML, CSS world, so to say, without going pixel-based.
Yeah.
And
there's going to be a lot of power, and I think we can all do terrible things with it or marvelous things with it.
What about content overflow if the content doesn't fit? If it's 100% grid, does the whole grid get bigger, or does it cut it off, or is it overflow defined in CSS, or can you overflow from one grid cell into another, like you can do with regions?
No, it doesn't work like regions. And it really depends on how you set things up. If you have things as auto, it's not going to overflow. You can set things as fixed height if you want to, but generally that's not a... I'm not really sure of the use case, but I love building stuff with this. So do send me things. People send me things to build, and I like that. So I'm very, very happy if someone wants to send me an example. How would you build this? I'll have a go.
That sounds like an interview question. If you add 6 rows, including gutters, and only add content to 2, do you get double spacing at the bottom?
Yes, I've seen that happen. Yes, because
no helping.
Yes, and I think it does happen. You get space because I've seen that occur. Yeah.
Does Rachel think CSS grid layouts will replace float-based layouts entirely when support is good enough?
I do hope so. Oh no, I hope that I hope that with Grid and Flexbox and some of the things that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, it feels complex for simple layouts for, say, 2 or 3 columns. Should or can we use Flexbox for that, and why shouldn't we?
Well, I don't think it's any more complex than Flexbox. I think it introduced a lot of new stuff. But if you look at something like the grid template area stuff, that is not complex. It's a different thing. You need to wrap your head around actually what you're doing. But it's not complex. It's no more complex than Flexbox taken, on its own. I think the problem is it's a huge spec, and so once you start looking at all of it, it's like, oh, there's so much we need to know. But you could do an awful lot totally ignoring all the later stuff in my presentation, just with the first 30 slides. You could do simple layout with that stuff.
So we now have to think about stuff before we do it?
Yes.
That's a complete change to web development from what
I thinking.
This is not working out, I'm sorry. Is there a way to easily show the lines of a grid? Perhaps grid lines visible, like border 1 on a table or something?
I don't think so, but I think what we need is some good developer tools for this stuff.
I think that's a developer tool issue as well. Yeah,
I think once this stuff is out there, we're going to see developer tools because it's ideal for that, and also for all sorts of authoring tools to come up and let us build things.
So the CSS grid layout is like the table layout, but without the ugly and non-semantic markup.
I think conceptually, a lot of the time, it's like working with tables. But that's because I'm old. So I don't know whether that's how other people think of it who never did table-based layouts.
Experienced.
Experienced, yeah.
How do browsers handle tab order when you change the visual order with CSS grid layout?
I'm not sure, and that's something I've got a big list of things to test, and that's one of them is around accessibility. So I definitely want to test that, and I'll stick some examples up when I do.
Excellent. It's the syntax is getting complex, isn't it, when you start looking at that? I mean, you could be evil and call your columns flex or center.
You could, yes.
And make it really confusing for people.
I think people shouldn't be evil.
Yeah, but and I always get it gets a bit weird when I see CSS specifications that create random names for things for you. Like when you said, like when you define a line, then the cells automatically get named for you. That kind of feels like magic in the browser. That feels like I should be doing this.
Yeah, I think with more complex layout methods, there's going to be complexity. We can't have better ways to do things without introducing complexity.
But I wanna.
It's kind of, but I think that also there's a really great chance with things like Grid for tools to help us with this stuff, because things have relationship. And going right back to when I was working with Dreamweaver, once we went to CSS Layout, Dreamweaver couldn't really help because it was difficult to work out, well, how do you position things and actually keep tabs of where they are? When it did broken up tables, it was fine. Whereas with this stuff, things have got relationship to each other, and so it's possible for browser tools or other authoring tools to help us create these things. I think far more than anything we've got at the moment.
Do you think that using CSS grid layout systems that we have right now is a benefit to this? Because you could technically generate the CSS grid CSS from the currently used HTML.
Yeah, and I thought that would be really interesting to see. It's not. I'm not a JavaScript person, so it's not my world. But I think there's an awful lot you could do in terms of converting one thing to another, or doing stuff in Sass. Converting. I think if people have come across the Suzy grid, I've got some examples of using that Suzy grid, sort of, can I replace that with grid layout on my site? And I think that's probably closer to stuff that people could be doing.
Excellent. I think that's all we got time for. So thanks very much again.
Thank you.